Hello, and I am now going to do something that I do occasionally, which is to take ancient political philosophy and ancient ethical thought and actually apply it to modern thinking. And we're going to go back to a lesson from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Herodotus' Histories. Um, and there's a somewhat famous quote um, that is attributed to one of the early seven sages of archaic Athens, which is call no man happy until he dies, only lucky. All right. Now, the first reference to this is from Herodotus' history, in which the sage Solon is talking to Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, and Croesus is flaunting his immense wealth, and asks Solon if anyone is happier than himself. And Solon responds, call no man happy until he is dead, only lucky. Then he says that Tellus is actually the exemplar of happiness. And Herodotus explains thusly: Tellus had both beautiful and good children, and he saw all his grandchildren from birth and all remaining alive, and at the end of his life was most brilliant. For when the Athenians had a war against their neighbors in Elysius, coming to the rescue and making a rout of the enemy, he died most beautifully, and the Athenians buried him publicly right where he fell and honored him greatly. His perfect life being thus the exemplary life, well lived and even dying in battle, that Solon wishes to tell people is the ancient Greek life. And we can only assess that in his death, because we know the entire story. Whereas we don't know Croesus' entire story. He may just be lucky and currently only have wealth. This is what is implied in the anecdote from Herodotus. Now, in Nicomachean Ethics, chapter 10, subtitled Should No Man Be Called Happy While He Lives, which explicitly references Solon and seems to reference Herodotus, although it may just be referencing popular history at this point. Aristotle really develops this out, and I have referenced this before, attributing it to Aristotle. It is most famously discussed in Aristotle, but the actual anecdote that makes it all make sense is in Herodotus. Now let's get into what it might mean, because it's often understood. This is one of the most famous chapters in the Nicomachean Ethics, and it captures the difference between the way the Greeks viewed eudaimonia, or what we might call happiness or contentment, and the way we view it. And also, this has implications far, far beyond just assuming what and who is happy. When Aristotle talks about happiness, he's almost always using the Greek word eudaimonia. When we talk about happiness, it is a mood, it is an emotion, it is a feeling of pleasure. But that's not the word that the Greeks would use for that feeling of pleasure. Eudaimonia is human flourishing, and it isn't something that you feel, it's something you achieve over the course of your entire life by striving to perfect virtue in accordance to wisdom and logic. All right. So Aristotle spent most of the Nicomachean Ethics and his politics arguing that eudaimonia is the ultimate goal of human life, and that a human life is virtue guided by reason being what is unique to us. Reason is only enacted through speech and sociality, so reason is always social, and virtue are the strengths that allow you to practice reason in your social life. because active practice or praxis, for those of you who wonder where we're getting this into Marxism, it comes from Moses Hess and Hegel, but comes ultimately from Aristotle, is a practice that is not a static emotion. Thus, you cannot judge a life by a single moment, a great year, or even a successful decade. And I'm going to come back to that because that's very important about why I get annoyed when I critique someone like Chomsky, or people talk about Chris Smalls or David Harvey or whoever, and you look at only their high points or their low points, where they're good or where they're bad, and you call the shots and on their entire life, career, and public effect based on that. I try not to do that. Even when I'm talking about someone like Brandon Johnson or Zoram Mamdani, I am not actually saying that we can judge their political career or their life off of what they've done in earlier to mid stages of their career, just where they're at right now. When I get a lot of pushback on like criticism of a figure, the big one lately was Chomsky, because of what happened at the end of his life. People will talk about like what he did during the Vietnam War or this, that, and the other. And I'm like, that's great. And no one's taking that away from him, but it doesn't change the rest of the trajectory or the limitations of his thought. And we can only call that towards the end of his life. And now that he's basically not really fully with us anymore and is dying, it's a lot more clear that his overall picture will be mixed because of things he did at the end of his life, making some of the things he did earlier on problematic. And people will say, oh, well, that doesn't have any effect on what he said and believed. That's a cop-out. And that's true for a lot of people, right? And most people are mixed bags, okay? So when you think about this, when you think about a tragic play or a football game, you can't declare it a masterpiece or a total victory at halftime or off one play. A bad third act, a late game collapse, an injury in the last minute changes the trajectory of the game. And even then, it doesn't ruin the whole game either. You have to, however, put it all in context. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is seen in a complete life, and the success can only be evaluated when the story is near the end or already finished. This is because good fortune, affect, good intentions, good actions even are limited and finite. Aristotle was a realist. Herodotus was a lot of things, but this is also something he was big in. Virtue is within our control, our circumstances are not. A person can live a deeply virtuous life, be successful and be honorable for most of it, and can still suffer catastrophic ruin at the very end and undo what he had priorly done. Or she, or they. Pick your pronoun. Now, Solon talked about Tellus and the King of Lydia. Aristotle brings up the King Priam of Troy. And this is pretty much the quote. No one calls Priam happy. Priam was noble, a virtuous king who ruled a magnificent city, had many children, and enjoyed his wealth. Yet in his old age, he watched all his sons die in battle, saw Troy burnt to the ground, and was brutally murdered at an altar. All right? If happiness were just a feeling, Priam would have been happy for most of his life. If bravery or success or virtue is just something that happens to you at a certain time, then you can say that they were certain that time they're relevant. But your good does not erase your bad and vice versa. All right. To come back to the Chomsky situation, I'm also going to talk about Chris Smalls, but to come back to the Chomsky situation, no one has undone the good reporting or the advocacy that Chomsky did about the war machine in Vietnam, regardless of how you feel about it with linguistics, regardless of how you feel about his ideological dependence on elites, or regardless whether You think he had a good class theory or not? I think he did some terrible things in regards to things he said. I don't think he was ethically an unethical person. I don't think the world has been made much worse by Chomsky, right? But I do think the end of his life, he made decisions, particularly after remarrying, that pointed out some of the flaws in his thinking his entire life that led him to one of his last public acts being um, playing with the private acts that were made public, playing with defending a guy who was undeniably questionable out of personal loyalty, and in doing so in such a way that has risked his reputation and credibility for generations. And yes, old people, you can go, oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, Chomsky did more good. That doesn't change the ethos, not the ethics, the ethos of what his decisions did and how people younger than him are going to view him. They're going to view him as a fool who associated with a predator. All right. Now, is Chomsky more than that? Absolutely. I also have other flaws with him. I've had complaints about Chomsky's uh, flaws for 20 years. His capitulating to the Democrats out of fear over and over and over again. His inconsistent anarchism, which generally just becomes some kind of vague moralizing left populism. But that doesn't mean he wasn't doing good work on the Vietnam War, for example, are sometimes made really bad mistakes. Particularly, the one I get really caught up in is his naivete on the U.S. role in the Cambodian Vietnamese War. All right. So we can't call Priam happy because of events at the very end of his life. And we can't call Chomsky successful because whether or not he did anything unethical, and I think he advocated for someone unethical, and that shows a lapse of judgment. I do not know that he did anything wrong beyond that, but that is his own problem, right? We can't say that Chomsky is going to be remembered in the same way as if it's the stuff that happened in the last 5 years of his life regarding Epstein didn't happen. And you might want to have the hero worship, but for me, that is irrelevant. All right. Let's get back to Solon Paradox. So the paradox from Solon is if you can only be called happy once you are dead, does it mean that you can only be happy when you no longer exist to experience it? And I would say Aristotle's answer is no. But he says a person is actually having when they are alive and practicing virtue. Outsiders can only safely attribute eudaimonia to that life securely from the vantage point of its completion, though. For Aristotle, calling someone happy isn't saying they are having a great day or even that they've done good things. It's saying they have lived a beautiful, excellent, fulfilled life. But because fortune is fickle and it affects virtue, and because virtue can falter, you can only call the game at the end. Now, when applying Aristotle's warning to hero worship, the friction between his concept of eudaimonia and our tendency to idolize figures in the present moment becomes very, very sharp. All right. Are to condemn people in the present moment too. Okay. I want to be very clear on this. It's not just an issue with being an idol, a worshiper, an idolater. No. Hero worship usually happens before a person's career or life is done. When they're at the height of their power, when they're delivering a great speech, winning an election, standing up against a war, doing something heroic. But Aristotle's philosophy warns us this is a dangerous category era. Call no man happy till they die is easily a critique of political idealization as much as anything else. Political hero worship relies on freezing a leader at the moment of triumph, ideological purity, success, etc. We treat a politician's career as a completed monument when in reality it is still actively unfolding narrative. We often are going to make a misleading picture of that person. If we condemn them mid-career, we're going to make a misleading picture of that person. So I mentioned Chris Smalls. Chris Smalls, from all accounts that I've ever talked to about the people in his initial organizing in the Amazon United, was an excellent retail organizer. He'd get people together. He advocated for himself. He did good. He was inspiring. There's a lot of criticisms, however, of him as a leader of the Amazon Union and of the stalling that union has had on trying to get out of anything beyond New York. And of Smalls being wined and dined by Democratic people during the Biden administration and often seemingly enjoying the attention that brought him. But Smalls is still a relatively young man. And I say that because if we'd have just stopped there, we might have a critique of Smalls going from almost the Peter principle of being a great initial organizer, but not a great union leader. And again, I'm not sure. I don't know this. Maybe he is a great union leader. Reports I've had from people who study this are wildly varied. But I will tell you, this happens a lot. The people who build something are not necessarily the good people to actually lead it when you are actually in a more established place. These are often different skill sets. It doesn't make you less of an organizer. It makes you a different kind of organizer. I'm a builder myself. I like building things. But as an established leader, I'm a little bit paranoid. I know that about me. I know that about me from being, management at various times in my life and often being in leadership of political organizations, building stuff up and then leaving because I, wasn't good at the maintaining and also got bored. But I actually try to compensate for that by not accepting the kinds of leadership positions that are static and stable and trying to take leadership positions that are good for what I'm actually good at. I'm good at analysis too. I'm good at fixing things, but if it's just maintaining things, you need another guy for that. Right? I, however, could let my ego get to my head and try to play all the roles that a leader can play to stay a leader. But that could lead to some really unfortunate inroads down the road. Now, when I talk about Chris Smalls, though, I'm also willing to put a little bit of charity in him, as there's a recent debate about him on X between DSA people that's totally not worth getting into. But that I said, look, for all the criticisms people have made since Chris Smalls got famous for his initial organizing, and the Amazon Union seems to be stuck in one shop. For all those criticisms that one may have, no matter how valid or invalid they are, one of the things we can say, however, is Chris Smalls used his fame to bring attention to the situation in Gaza, and he should get credit for that as part of the ledger of his overall life and career. And he's still a young man. He probably will outlive me. I will not be able to make a call on the virtue of Chris Smalls. And absolutely. Same thing with Mamdani. Now, we're getting closer with Bernie Sanders, sadly, so maybe we will be able to make a call there. But even that, some things won't be obvious at first. All right? But to go back to Aristotle in this quote, for Aristotle, a political life is like any other life. It is an ongoing practice of virtue or of vice. Things that help your goal or eliminate it. When we worship a political figure, we are declaring the game won. We often do it way before it's time to do so. History is littered with leaders who achieved immense positive breakthroughs early in their tenure or career, only to succumb to ego-driven authoritarianism, catastrophic policy blunders, personal corruption in their later years, or just being senile, or just being unlucky. By evaluating them too early, We blind ourselves to a tragic third act that can even change the meaning of their earlier work. Political hero worship is always usually a worship of reputation, rhetoric, or the projection of ideology. It is not a sober assessment of what Aristotle was concerned about, eudaimonia, but it also isn't even a good, a consequentialist view of the entire effect of a person's career. So we'll talk about what Aristotle was concerned with, but what we might use this for. Aristotle argued that true flourishing requires long-term stable disposition towards virtue, guided by practical wisdom, which he called phronesis. Politics, by contrast, rewards the appearance of virtue greatly, whether or not the virtue is actually there. A charismatic leader can project strength, can enact the image of justice, can virtue signal about wisdom, and can do it through creative media and grand speeches. We idolize them based on these impressions oftenly, and we can confuse a good mood or a successful public relations campaign or even one sincerely good event with actually deep-rooted excellence. That's why I'm very hesitant to call politicians. That's why personally, I don't really like endorsing for politicians. When I have a chance to vote against an endorsement, I tend to vote against it, not even because I don't believe in these politicians. Because I think endorsement should be done on the grounds of a criteria which we agree on, like a program that is clear and articulated, so I have a yardstick to measure by, and that I can only call the adherence to the program step by step, and that you have to do a tit-for-tat relations for that game strategically. And by that I mean, when someone does right by you, you should do right by them, and when someone does wrong by you, you should do wrong by them. That tends to be the optimal way to correct. It shouldn't necessarily be quid pro quo, but what you're doing is enforcing virtue as far as your view of it would go from the Aristotelian standpoint. But I'm not just saying that, like, you can't even call if someone was good or bad. Part of my point about talking about Chomsky is I think you can't excuse what he did at the end of his life, even if you still think most of the rest of the stuff he did was justifiable. Aristotle's example of King Priam actually makes it clear that some of this is about circumstances beyond your control anyway. Leaders in a political realm or in organizing or in whatever are in a highly volatile, highly complex, unpredictable systems, plural, where there are many things outside of their control, but can still undermine the effect of what they do. A political hero might be celebrated during a period of economic stability or peace, or when they specifically stood up to power, only be broken by an unexpected crisis. A famine, an economic collapse, a war, a bad friend choice really comes to haunt you. Misunderstanding your own skill set. Hero worship also tends to set up a fragile expectation of infallibility. And so when people break, they become disillusioned. If you're never illusioned, it's hard to be disillusioned. If you have a responsive, I'm not going to say transactional. I don't think the tit for tat thing I'm talking about is just merely transactional. It's just a responsive relation. When someone does right by you, you do right by them. But if they don't do right by you, you don't have to betray them, but you don't necessarily continue to be in their orbit. All right. Now, here's another thing that I really want you to think about when it comes to Aristotle. Even death doesn't settle it. All right. When a political figure passes away, Aristotle's rule can even have a twist because the politician's life doesn't end with their life. Their narrative continues to unfold through the consequences of their policies and who and how they are maintained. So it's very hard to call. We might be dealing, sometimes with the results of what Jimmy Carter did in 1977 today. Actually, we very much are. Beginnings of neoliberalism as an economic policy start there, now with Reagan. Despite what progressives and analytical Marxists might try to have you believe. We must always be critical and vigilant in our evaluations of individual political actors and their long-term consequences. Bernie might be perfectly moral, fail catastrophically, and it might damage the socialist movement in ways that none of us foresee. It does not mean an ongoing cynicism. It does mean a skepticism that is willing to be vigilant and willing to call strikes. Not necessarily condemn the person off of the strike, though. And I think that confuses a lot of people about me. Just because I say that something is not praiseworthy does not mean that I think that that person is worthless or need to be thrown out of the movement or removed from our memory. And, damnatio memorare. I don't necessarily believe that. All right. We need to treat human beings in an active, complex world that half of which is beyond their control. Remember that men make their own history, but the material of that history is not of their own making. To paraphrase Marx very closely, though. We cannot understand all the implications of a political or any kind of life until we can contextualize it in its context as a whole. And in some ways, you can't do that for anybody in totality. But hero worship is stupid politics. Leaders need to be protected, but they also need to be made accountable and constrained. And when you don't, and when loyalty only goes one way, well, I think you can look to the current executives of many countries, including the one I'm in, for how that goes. Like and subscribe. Protect your peace. And remember, even the ancients can sometimes help you keep building a better world. Or at least keep yourself smart and sane. Take care.